This is Sportish.
Do it better.
This is Sportish. This is Sportish. This is Sportish. This is Sportish.
This is Sportish. It's the show about sports, ostensibly started during a global sports shutdown. My name is Geoff Brault. I'm joined as always by Dr. Keith Strudler. He is the director of the School of Communication and Media at Montclair State University. Our producer is Mike Wallace. Thanks so much for hanging out with us here on For the Fans Network, or perhaps you're catching us in podcast form, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts. It doesn't matter. We're on all of them. But Keith, we've been most enjoying our own show on television. At least you have. I actually don't watch us on TV because I think it's weird to watch yourself on television. You do not share that view.
Why would you think it's weird? Well, if you can't, wait. If you can't love yourself, how can you expect other people to love you? I not only do I feel like I am setting the example for our listeners, I also want to make sure we look good. Like I'm not just looking at admiring, I'm looking and critiquing. Although I have to say, haven't found a whole lot to critique yet.
Well, you took my second question. Do we look good?
We look not so bad. Not so bad. We got some lighting, nothing a little makeup couldn't fix. But I would like to give a shout out to my mom, who is one of our now loyal listeners. Although she only made it through 12 minutes of the last show, there was a little technical issue, and she said we were great. She said good rapport. She did ask if anyone watches. So if you're watching on TV, why don't you hit us up on Twitter so we know that, so I can tell my mom, yes, as a matter of fact, a lot of people are watching.
We are at SportishPod on Twitter. You can see Keith and I, our Twitter handles are at the bottom of the screen. Here's what's coming up on this episode. We're going to talk a lot about the NFL. Not so much how the NFL is working through their issues to get back and try to play during the coronavirus pandemic, but, Washington, D.C. has cropped up quite a bit in the NFL this week, both because of the Washington Redskins under owner Dan Snyder embroiled in a controversy about some workplace malfeasance. There was an article in Politico, and that article was entitled, "They Realize the Bully is Kind of an Empty Suit." And the bully in this instance is President Donald J. Trump. And Donald Trump has had a long history with the NFL. It all came out in this article. We've got senior staff writer Michael Kruse on the program. He's the author of that article. We're going to talk all about how the presidency and the NFL have intersected over the last 4 years. We're also going to get into college sports return. It's looking bleak with more conferences falling off of the fall sports train. But first, this right now, midnight on Thursday on the East Coast is opening day for Major League Baseball. As we started this podcast, we wanted to chronicle sports return under coronavirus, this unprecedented pandemic that none of us have ever experienced in our lifetimes. One of, I think, the most surreal moments happened this week, and it's about Major League Baseball coming back. The middle of July. We sit here in the middle of July, a pandemic that started in earnest, at least in terms of the sports world, in mid-March. The Toronto Blue Jays, who, as you would expect, play their home games in Toronto, Canada, a country that has flattened the curve and are significantly ahead of the United States in coronavirus, have told the Toronto Blue Jays that they cannot play their home games because they do not want teams traveling to Toronto from America. They've basically said, we can't risk plane loads of American baseball players coming in to play the Blue Jays in Toronto. So they're looking elsewhere, maybe their spring training home in Dunedin, maybe their AAA home in Buffalo. But boy, is that not a sad marker of where we are in this country with this virus, as Canada saying, America, you keep your baseball teams out of our country.
Well, I guess it affirms the narrative that this truly is America's sport. We've taken it completely back because no one wants to partake in our version of this game. It's interesting, Toronto, one of the more pleasant places to have some summer baseball, moving down to Florida, just beyond the simple risk of the virus, they are going to be playing in infinite heat. And as much as those spring training stadiums are lovely, what they are not is domed and air conditioned. So it is, if you can remember back far enough, you remember an era when there was discussion of certainly putting NBA teams over in Europe and obviously NFL teams. And a lot of that was predicated on the Concorde. And if we can get these players back fast enough, and that all kind of fizzled. now we can't even get teams to play across like a border, like something you can just drive back and forth across. It is very much a sad state of affairs. And it does kind of reaffirm this idea that sports are not completely devoid of what's happening in the rest of the country. So, you can make people have argued whether or not sports are a reflection of society, whether they're a bellwether for what's to come, or whether they're simply reflective of what's happened. At the very least, we certainly know, particularly when it comes to this virus, it is highly interwoven. And you do have to wonder if this is a bad portent for the Toronto franchise in general. I mean, this is not a good step if this baseball team is forced to play their entire shortened season in a city that's not their own.
I think what it says is just how far America's reputation has fallen, especially reputation as it comes to managing this virus. Because if you look at what Major League Baseball has done, and granted the players have not begun traveling yet, but if you look at their testing numbers, they're great. I mean, it's less than 0.1% of players have tested positive, and that's of a sample of over 10,000 tests. The virus does not really exist in the Major League Baseball world, at least the players and the staff members that are being tested. But that said, Canada still does not feel as though it is safe to have even tested Americans traveling into their country.
The real challenge for baseball is going to be how long will they be able to maintain that rate? And, as players, it's hard to put a bubble around yourself, essentially what you're talking about when you're moving around from city to city. So we'll see. I mean, as you've seen in the NFL, a lot of players are very concerned about how they are handling testing and protocols. Baseball seems to be doing as much as they can to at least know what they're dealing with. And as anyone knows, and where we seem to be failing miserably in this country is we don't even know what we're actually dealing with. So baseball, to give them credit, they seem to be fairly aware. Who was the baseball player, by the way, the Yankee that hit the home run with the mask on?
Didi Gregorius took Max Scherzer a yard with the mask on. Clint Frazier is the Yankee who's famously where he was the first one to come out and say he's going to wear the face mask while he was batting. A number of players have actually followed suit and said they're going to do that both for safety and because they believe it sets a good example for the rest of the country. It's actually not as uncommon as you think. A lot of times when baseball would drag on into October or even November for playoff games and World Series games, players would wear like ski masks to stay warm. Yeah. So this is just sort of an extension of that, I think, even though it's the middle of summer.
Yeah, it's hard to argue, though, for all the people like, I can't wear this mask, I can't breathe. And some guy's going 500 feet. And it's really hard. It's really hard to argue like this thing is so uncomfortable when an athlete can do that. Obviously, baseball not quite as aerobically taxing as perhaps some of the other sports, but still, I do think, I think that athletes can still be a very important part in changing the narrative on the virus in this country. And if perhaps that could be one of the most important tools or one of the most important things they could accomplish over the next several months, if they set the example and if they, as you're seeing a lot of professional athletes and people in the NCAA and certainly sports writers say, if you want football, if you want basketball, then wear the mask. And I like that storyline a lot.
Baseball is not only resuming under coronavirus conditions, they're also resuming under labor strife. There was a long labor battle just to even get a 60-game season to be played, and that's what baseball is hoping to do. How about what Alex Rodriguez came out and said? Boy, has he quickly made the turn as Alex Rodriguez is trying to be part of a group to buy the Mets. He suggested this week, and then he immediately walked it back and said, I didn't suggest that, but he absolutely suggested that Major League Baseball consider a salary cap, that the players and owners work together to grow revenue and then share that revenue. That's a salary cap. He didn't use the word salary cap, but that's how the NBA does it. That's how the NFL does it. That's how you end up with a salary cap. Alex Rodriguez, the guy who's made more money off baseball contracts than any other human in the history of the planet, is now suggesting that the Major League Baseball Players Association needs to accept the salary cap for the good of the game, even though, to his credit, he did never use the word salary cap. He just described what a salary cap is.
So he was probably the player blamed with breaking baseball economics as we know it. And I forget who that was on the NBA side. The player, was it? I'm blanking on the guy's name, but Grandmama. Who was Grandmama? The basketball player. We referred to him as Grandmama. Yes, I believe Larry Johnson may have gotten the balloon contract that everyone said the whole thing is done now. That A-Rod, destroyed the Rangers, right? I mean, just completely killed the Rangers with the contract that he signed, and then, kind of built the Yankees as well. Look, there's a saying that if you are young and you are not liberal, you do not have a heart. And if you are older and you are not conservative, you do not have a brain. That is obviously a simplification, particularly in today's politics, but there's a little something of that with A-Rod. When he was young, he was like power to the people. And now that it's his money, well, not so fast. I will say, and I think we disagree a little bit on this, I happen to be a fan of a salary capped league, even though I understand the balance of power it might give to the owners. Because they're dealing in certainty. Although I think that could be negotiated in the contract, where you just argue for a greater percentage and you make sure that there's some flex in the cap. I just think that for competitive balance and for long-term maintenance of the league, I like the idea of a salary cap league. I feel like, as much as everyone likes to talk about how sport is this wonderful enterprise of a capitalistic nation, it actually works, to me, a little bit better as a socialist enterprise. And I think it's the thing that keeps professional sports from being more like college sports. And I love college sports. College sports, the divide between the haves and the have-nots is so pronounced they can barely stay on the same field. And you don't see that in pro sports.
Well, I mean, I agree with you. If you want the most fair league, if you want the league in which every team will essentially on a rotating basis have the same chance to win a championship, it has to be a salary cap league. There's no question that's how you get the best competition. The problem is, why in the world do the players want that? They don't care. They want to get as much money as possible. And it is without question the sport that enriches its labor force the most, that being baseball. I mean, you got fully guaranteed contracts at uncapped rates that go up into the, $300, $400 million range. They're getting that money regardless of their performance, regardless of anything. It's not like the NFL where they can cut you with the drop of a hat. Like, when you sign that deal, that money will show up in your bank account at some point. Why in the world would the players ever accept a salary cap?
They shouldn't, which is why you end up with strikes and lockouts. I mean, you never should. Now that, to be fair, though, you are much more likely to get that if you're playing in one of the have franchises. There are a lot of teams that do not pay players nearly that same currency and that rate. And you could make the argument that because of that cap, it could be also another way in which players are kind of squeezed out of the league in some cases, I suppose. Look, I happen to think I don't know why a player would ever actually agree for it, because why would you want to put a cap on your own earnings, unless you think it's going to run the whole thing under, unless you feel that at some point, unless there's some collective good, if you can negotiate 55% of all revenues to the players, there's a point at which I know you still want the money.
It won't run the whole thing under, because the demise of baseball has been greatly exaggerated for the last 75 years. I mean, this sport's been dying since before it began.
The one thing that baseball has, and it will always have, at least for the time being, although not this year, is it just has unlimited content. And so when you have a surplus of content and people still want to go watch live games, you're going to do okay. I will say, and again, it's always true until it isn't. This year, depending on what happens with, people staying away from ballparks and a very shortened season, I don't know what the other side of this is going to look like. So there are obviously going to be some real pain that comes through this process, because we're going to spend a year of people not going to watch sporting events live. No, even if we get these seasons through, we're going to play the U.S. Open. We're going to have, college basketball season. And as as we've heard many times, they're going to play. And I talked to someone who works with a lot of the basketball conferences. They're going to play the NCAA basketball tournament. Like, I don't care if it's in March, April, May, June, July, they are going to play, because if they don't play the NCAA basketball tournament, the NCAA will cease to exist as we know it. There's no money left. They will have to collapse the whole thing and redo it. But that said, the other side of this is going to be very different. And I do assume that baseball will come out, I don't know about fine, but will be okay. But I don't think it's going to be as easy, because they've gone, an entire year without selling out 162 games.
Funny that your source has so much optimism and so much certainty that the NCAA basketball tournament is going to be played. It sure sounds like how a lot of the college football media and college football coaches and college athletic administrators and conference administrators were speaking about a college football season back in March. And here we sit in the middle of July as teams would be getting ready to report, and conference after conference at the Division I level and below are saying absolutely not to fall sports. Since we spoke with Andy Noel, the Cornell AD, last week, the Patriot League has joined the Ivy League. The Colonial Athletic Association has joined the Ivy League. The Atlantic 10 has joined the Ivy League in canceling the fall. A number of other conferences have said we're not going to be having non-league play. We're not going to be having summer mini camps. It sure doesn't seem like we're going to have much, if any, Division I college sports in the fall. Now, Keith, youth sports have come back just about everywhere in the country. Pro sports have come back. Quarantine bubbles are working. It seems like every level of athletics can figure out a way to play. College sports aren't happening. Conferences go away each and every day. Why can college athletics not figure out a way to safely resume in this current climate?
I think there's probably a couple of reasons. It's the place where they have the most freedom. I mean, youth sports, look, I got a couple kids that play youth sports. We can control almost everything about their environment, as can, their organizations. Our travel is very limited. So it's a highly controlled environment where we at least want to believe that the athletes aren't as susceptible to getting sick. And we used to think that they weren't as likely to transmit it, although that seems to be unlikely as well. And so I think it's a little bit easier to contain that. And so in youth sports, the transition from we're just having practices, we're having scrimmages, to we're having a pseudo season, it's almost a little bit of a sliding scale. College sports a little bit more official. You don't go from having your orange and blue scrimmage to all of a sudden you're traveling to Alabama on a dime like that. It's a little bit more complicated. So I would say that the lack of control, college athletes are going on a college campus and they're going to do what college people are going to do. And it's often not the most sanitary. I mean, there's a reason you have to get a lot of shots before you go to college. It's because you are exposed to a lot of bad things, right? I can remember this was years and years ago when there was a measles outbreak in the Northeast. You remember this is on the tail end of when Siena had to play, a game in an empty arena, like that.
Yes. Yep.
Mm-hmm. And I was kind of a revisit of that, and maybe a year or two later, and there was a measles outbreak in the Northeast, and I was getting ready to go to a meet, and coach was like, "Do you have a page for your measles shot?" I was like, "I don't know." He's like, "You're getting a measles shot before you." So I literally ran to the clinic. I was like, "Give me a measles shot," and I got on the bus and ran the meet. Did not run well, but you're exposed to a lot. And then the second thing for college sports is it is predicated on travel. That's how these things work. And youth sports, we might drive 15 minutes down to Glen Rock to play that team. That's a whole, so we've got two bubbles of 12, playing, that's a whole lot different than the traveling circus that in particular is college football.
I'm glad you brought up your past health history, because I think the people need to know this. You're playing hurt this week. I mean, look, you've done a great job fighting through some pain thus far this show. You are not playing at 100%.
Yeah. So look, I don't like to complain. I think
that is not true. Do not lie to the people. Do not lie to the people.
I think people that know me would say I'm a team player.
Nope.
I'm humble.
Also incorrect.
I rarely brag. I don't like to talk about myself. Nope. And I'm tough as nails.
Maybe the last one, although you are afraid of needles, yet will run triathlons. So
it's funny.
Who knows?
I would much rather make myself bleed than have someone draw blood. I'm like, oh, you need a blood sample? Let me run until my feet bleed through my shoes. Then you can take it that way. I hate needles, but I'll do it. So I was grilling. We put a grill in our backyard. We have one of those gas hookups, like that was already in the house. So I plugged that in 50-50. I thought I was going to explode the whole thing, but I got this. So I don't even have to have the propane tank. I got it hooked right in. Now, as you know, I'm one of the chosen people, not only my religion, but also my choice of food as a vegetarian. So I do not participate in the demise of these beautiful animals that were graced to us as their kind of, we were there to live in conjunction with them, along with them. So I was grilling some vegetables and some mushrooms, some peppers, and some Impossible burgers, which I don't know if you've tried any yet. Have you tried any?
I have. They're actually really good. They're really good.
They're really delicious. Come on over and I'll grill you some Impossible burgers when I get my right hand back. So what happened is I took I was getting this stuff, and I'm a grill master, and I took one of those metal skewers with all these, and I put it on the plate. And for whatever reason, I forgot immediately that it had just come off the fire. And so I just grabbed it with my right hand, instantly realized that was a mistake, ran inside screaming like a small child, at which point Andra, I think, was trying to get me sent to the hospital, because everything she told me when I kept looking up on the internet was like, please do not do this. Like, do not do this. So my hand's hurting. I almost went to the ER. I started crying, and Andra gave up. She was nice for, like, to her credit, she was very caring for the first 20 minutes. And then she's like, why don't you go to the ER and talk to them instead? So I am playing hurt. I have these streaky marks down my hand. It's difficult. So I've got one hand that I'm using. It's difficult, but you know, it's still a great show. It's still a great show. Should I ask this to Michael when he comes on?
No, Lord, no. Please do not bring him into this.
Hey, Michael, have you ever burned your hand?
That is not one of the 5 questions in which we need to ask all of our guests before we begin to interview them. But we are about to talk about the NFL. I'm going to talk with Michael Kruse, who's a senior staff writer for Politico, in just a second, as he wrote an article this week called "They Realize the Bully is Kind of an Empty Suit," and the bully refers to President Donald Trump. I do want to get your thoughts on another big NFL issue that took place in Washington, D.C. this week, a bombshell report in the Washington Post about how the Washington Redskins is a very hostile workplace environment for women, a laundry list of sexual harassment claims from all different levels of the organization, from football operations staff to the radio broadcaster, just acting in ways that you cannot act in a workplace. And it's another black mark on a franchise owned by Dan Snyder that has had an awful lot of black marks over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and so, you know, the challenges, and as this story has come out, you also have heard a lot of female sports reporters in particular say, you know, that's happened to me, not at the Washington franchise. So there's going to be a couple of moments of reckoning that are going to need to happen. First, obviously, deep dive into Washington and some real serious questions now about whether or not Dan Snyder is going to be able to stay an owner in the NFL. I mean, at this point, there isn't enough necessarily information to make that happen. And that will only happen based on the will of the other owners. So that's going to be the first thing that's going to happen. It is interesting, the timing of the story, that it came, you know, right as Dan Snyder was about to say, look, I'm not such a bad guy. And then there's a reminder of, oh, yes, you are. The second question, though, is kind of, as I referred to, is this a Washington problem, or is this a sports problem? And I think that's really the question that we need to start asking. People have known for quite some time that there were issues in Washington. There were certainly some issues around how they were treating their cheerleaders. I mean, this has been a long-standing problem for the franchise. The more serious question is going to be, is this something that is really spread across not just the NFL, but sports in general? And if so, I think it's an important moment of reckoning for sure.
Dan Snyder has very famously said that he will never, ever change the name of that franchise. Do you think he will?
I think he will, because I don't think he's going to have a choice. I think Roger Goodell will have a conversation with him on behalf of the other owners. And I think, you know, I understand that Goodell works for the owners and Snyder's a pretty powerful owner. I think there's enough look, they're pretty good at reading polls, which we'll talk about in our interview for sure. I think they know where the public stands on this. So I think they will change the name sooner than later.
Let's get to our guest. Michael Kruse is a senior staff writer at Politico and the author of the article "They Realize the Bully is Kind of an Empty Suit" about Donald Trump and his contentious, long-standing relationship with the NFL and the political issues that have arisen from that sports league. Michael, thank you so much for hanging out with us.
Thanks for the invite.
I know Keith and I both very much enjoyed your article that dropped a few days ago. For anyone who hasn't had the chance yet to get over to Politico and read it, can you give us a brief characterization of exactly the type of piece you put together?
Well, so I was interested in the long arc history of President Trump's tiff with the NFL. It is a feud that goes back more than 40 years, really. So when we see this happening now in a political context, starting, of course, really heavily in 2017, but it has come up again of late, there is a deeper backstory. And to truly understand why the president is fighting the NFL in this way and why he is not only continuing to fight, but doubling down on the Colin Kaepernick controversy and the kneeling controversy and all that is sort of in the conversation, it is important to look back and understand that this is something with deep, deep roots, and it is not something that the president is going to give up lightly. He's going to fight this through the fall. However, we have football or don't have football coming up. It is going to be, I think, a factor, a feature, a real part of this re-election campaign as we get into these last 3.5 months heading into November 3rd.
One of the things I think the piece chronicled very well is that a lot of outside entities ascribe politics to football, whether it's politicians, whether it's talking heads, whatever it may be, up until maybe very recently. And Roger Goodell's statement supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, I'm not certain if the NFL really ever considered itself political. Do you think the NFL considered themselves a political institution before, say, perhaps a month ago?
Not really, but it doesn't matter what the NFL considers or doesn't consider a political institution. Football, professional football, the NFL is such an important piece of our culture. I mean, arguably too important, but it is what it is. It is so important. And so everything that is happening in American culture can be funneled through that prism as well. That's what we've seen sort of throughout the Trump presidency. He has brought so much of this stuff to the fore, but I would argue that sports has never been not political. I mean, it is because of its primary place in our culture, not just sports. The NFL is arguably the largest, not only sports entertainment property, but entertainment property. I mean, Sundays are the NFL in America, for better or for worse. So how could it be divorced from the most important political debates of any time? But Donald Trump has had a way of certainly bringing this to the fore and making people take sides. And what is, I think, most important here in the last couple months is how the NFL has changed. I think the NFL has decided as an institution, with the thing that we're involved with, whether we like it or not, as politics averse as it institutionally wants to be, that's just not an option anymore. I think the NFL is responding to the change in public sentiment that we're seeing in public polling that we just sort of understand anecdotally since the death of George Floyd in late May. And so we're in a different situation. The NFL has changed the form of how they've responded to players and their demands. Wanted to hear Roger Goodell say the things that he said. I mean, he responded to the players essentially by reading their script back to them. That is an enormous shift that I don't even know that NFL fans totally appreciate how much of a shift that is. Roger Goodell is not going to say that stuff. He's not going to say Black Lives Matter. He's not going to say systemic racism, oppression, if enough owners aren't okay with him saying that. So it represents a fundamental shift in the NFL's posture on this front. The only thing that hasn't changed, public sentiment, the way the NFL is treating this, the only thing that hasn't changed is the president's rhetoric. Obviously, he's not going to give it up. He's going to fight this fight to the end, whether he wins it or not.
You made the point that the NFL might be the only purple sport, or at least it aspires or hopes to be. And the NFL is not the NBA, which is far more progressive and can have a, shall we say, smaller audience and still do quite well. Can a body like the NFL, what we've known for the past, 30, 40 years in this country, can it exist in this highly polarized world where purple is, doesn't seem to be a whole lot of purple, at least not certainly in social media, but does the NFL, while they may be now kind of recognizing that they have to change, I suppose, can the NFL still be an attractive institution to 60, 70% of the American populace? Will 50% of America still watch the Super Bowl as we kind of evolve as a country?
I mean, we'll see. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think yes. I mean, football has such a stranglehold, professional football, college too, has such a stranglehold on the attention span of many, many Americans that until and unless we see some very real pullback from that, I'm skeptical that would happen. That's what you see the NFL calculating here too. for the people we might lose, we're going to pick up some other people, and still they're operating with such a giant audience. I mean, an audience that almost puts, you mentioned the NBA, Major League Baseball too. I mean, these are sort of, relatively speaking, almost niche audiences relative to the behemoth that is the NFL, that is college football. I mean, those are the two most popular sports in this country, right? The NFL and college football to some extent. I think it was interesting to see the president's interaction with NASCAR when it came to the Confederate flag and Bubba Wallace. Arguably the only friendlier sport in this country, the only Trump-friendlier sport in this country is NASCAR. And he was at odds with that as well. You know, NASCAR gets behind Bubba Wallace. NASCAR institutionally says the Confederate flag is no longer okay. And the president is saying, I'm not okay with that. But if Donald Trump, given his political base, is not okay with NASCAR, that suggests that he is out of step with a piece of this country that he can't afford to be out of step with in terms of his electoral prospects.
You know, you made the point early on and throughout the article that so much of what's happening now is driven by a grudge that Trump has because he wasn't able to get into that country club, right? And I assume you watch Billions like all of us do, and it harkens back to who's our, oh my God, I'm blanking on names. Who's our billionaire on Billions?
Bobby Axelrod?
Bobby Axelrod, of course, was also denied an opportunity to buy an NFL franchise, and that was the true I've made it. Could you explain a little bit about Trump's obsession with being allowed into that club? And since you've studied this, what's the difference between owning an NFL team and, say, owning a baseball team? I mean, there are other things you could buy.
I mean, I think he calculated early on in the 80s that one way to make himself relevant, make himself a media magnet in a way that even developing real estate was not performing as a function for him at that time, was to own a football team. He bought into the second-rate USFL, the United States Football League, in 1983. You can make a strong argument that not Trump Tower, nothing else up until that point in his public life, talking 10 years of being sort of a semi-public figure in New York City, nothing to that point made him beyond New York known, name known / famous, more than buying the USFL's New Jersey Generals. I mean, this is not a top-flight football team, but even that put him in a kind of limelight he had not yet experienced. Part of the reason it put him in the limelight was how he operated as an owner. He made it very clear from the get-go in 1983, 1984, into 85, that he was at war with the NFL, that he wanted to use the USFL to either harm the NFL sufficiently to make his league have a better shot, or create such a ruckus that the NFL would say, hey, come on in, essentially horn his way into the NFL. That didn't work at all. USFL, but certainly pushed first and foremost by Donald Trump, filed an antitrust lawsuit against the against the NFL in the mid-'80s, did not go well at all, fairly directly led to the ending of the USFL. That was his first effort, his first attempt, the first way he tried to get himself into that elite club. The 30 or so owners, now 32 of them, of NFL teams. You know, as I point out in the piece, there are some elite clubs of note in this country. The United States Senate, there are 100 of them, right? One of the most elite clubs in America. But there are only 32 NFL owners. He wanted to be one of those 32. Lots of ill will because of how he operated as the owner of the New Jersey Generals, but he came back in 2014. How serious he was as a potential bidder for the Buffalo Bills, sort of up for debate. Probably not that serious ultimately, but he made a lot of noise trying to present himself as a potential new owner of the Buffalo Bills. Also didn't work out. And then about a year later, he starts running for president. There's only one of them, right? So he had the last laugh on that front. But from 1983 on, and even really 1981, when he starts talking about wanting to buy the Baltimore Colts, for Pete's sake, he has been thinking about this, wanting to be an NFL owner. Didn't work out, but being president somehow did work out. And so he was able to leverage some of that power. I mean, obviously, it goes without saying. He has a measure of power. It was unforeseeable in 2014, even when he was talking about buying the Buffalo Bills, and so was able to have some real leverage over these guys that had repeatedly rejected him, not really wanted him, not really considered him to be one of them. Didn't quite see the funds, the resources there in a real way to join their billionaires club, and kept him at arm's length until they couldn't anymore, until he was president and they had to listen to him and respond to him one way or another. And that's what we saw, especially in 2017. Started in 2016 when he was running for president and talking about the NFL, but certainly when it came to 2017 and he upped the ante and intensified his rhetoric when it came to Colin Kaepernick and the kneeling, that is when the NFL owners really had to acknowledge that Donald Trump is somebody they had to deal with one way or another.
They also seemingly allowed Trump to control that narrative and win that debate. He is the one who took the focus away from Kaepernick's initial protest being about police brutality and found a way to make it about the flag. And an awful lot of people went along with Donald Trump. Now, in the article, you chronicle how much that has changed since 2017. And obviously, I think history has clearly pointed out that Colin Kaepernick was correct and ahead of his time. And now the NFL has caught up to Colin's point. Does the fact that the NFL has moved in the way that it has in such a short time, especially with an election coming up in a couple months, does that serve as a bellwether for exactly how much peril Trump may be in?
I think it does. I mean, this is sort of the fundamental argument of this piece, that because he is no longer simpatico with the NFL institutionally and with the NFL owners, it seems, judging from that Goodell video statement responding so affirmatively to the players, conclusion you can draw is that they have made the calculation that power Trump had, what leverage he had in 2017 into 2018, even through 2019, has dissipated enough to where they think this is not going to be sort of a business calamity. It's not going to hit their bottom line as much now as it did in 2017. I mean, they're looking at numbers and saying, gosh, we need to tread lightly here because ultimately, let's be frank, the NFL's job, I'm not even passing judgment, the NFL's job and their owner's job is to sell football. And so if something, anything, is harming that bottom line, it's something they obviously consider very, very seriously. I think what now is the country has moved so much in terms of public sentiment and sympathy for not only Black Lives Matter, but just the overall idea of racial justice, the acknowledgement of the lack of racial justice until this point. They have made the calculation based on my reporting and from public signals that that is where they need to be from a business standpoint, not even just what is right or wrong, but it's okay to be here from a business standpoint. And if the NFL, the colossus that is the NFL, is making that judgment at this point, it certainly suggests that there is some real political peril for Donald Trump. Now, there's lots of other stuff going on, too, that contributes to that political peril. But this is one way, I think, to see how he is increasingly out of step with where the country is. Not the whole country, of course. I mean, in my inbox, in my Twitter mentions, after that story ran, I hear from lots and lots of people who are, just like the president, very angry that the NFL has shifted its stance at this point. But I think that number, it's not a question of whether you still have those people who are there who think like that. It's a question of how much of them, what is the share? And it gets to the base question. Donald Trump could not, even in 2016, win base only. No politician can, right? You need a coalition. And there was enough of a coalition in 2016. This suggests that the base, the people who are still on his side when it comes to the NFL, they're never going anywhere. They're always going to vote for him. But is that a big enough share in important enough areas in the most important states? Is that a big enough share the president is going to be able to pull it out again in 2020? Who knows? We'll see. But the cultural currents right now, and cultural currents you can see through the prism of the NFL, I think, are veering more and more away from him. And there's still 3.5 months to go, and we'll see. It's a volatile period in our history, to say the least. So this is not necessarily a prediction, but right now it seems like the cultural currents are going in a bit of a different direction when it comes to the president and his stance vis-a-vis the NFL.
Yeah. One final question. It was going to be whether or not Davidson's glory days of basketball are in fact behind them. I know that's important to you as a Davidson graduate, but I just want to know how important is it for Trump that the NFL has a successful season?
You know, if the NFL can't play games that look more or less like NFL games, it is an immediate visual sign that things are very, very wrong and continue to be very, very wrong. That can't help but reflect poorly on the current leader of this country / traditionally leader of the free world. You know, he has talked at length from the get-go. I mean, almost right away in April, early April, he was talking about how important it is for the NFL to have its season. So here we are, you know, staring down the chute at the NFL season, and if anything, it's gotten worse from a COVID standpoint. So, you know, I'm trying to play out the scenarios here, and I'm envisioning NFL games that are happening in mostly empty stadiums. There are no fans there to boo. Guaranteed, especially early on, you're going to have many, many players, if not all players, kneeling. The NFL is going to be okay with that, judging from what I heard reporting this story. And so you're going to have some really interesting scenes, and that's assuming if the NFL is even able to play. I mean, you know, we're in late July. We are in the place in the calendar where you start to have training camp and you start to really run up. You're weeks away from preseason games in a normal year, right? And everything is so up in the air. So I think if the NFL season, more than any other sport, if the NFL season can't happen and can't happen in a way that looks anything remotely like what we are accustomed to seeing, that is short of, you know, continued remote schooling, which is a reality in most places. That is I struggle to come up with a more blinking red light indicator for the country as a whole that we are still very much not out of this, and that can't help but influence how people are feeling when they think about voting as we approach November 3rd.
Our guest is Michael Kruse. The article is They Realize the Bully is Kind of an Empty Suit. You can find it at Politico. Go read it. Wildly interesting stuff and a very interesting conversation. Thank you so much for your time, Michael.
Thanks for having me.
Woo! So, Keith, what we couldn't get to there is something that comes up in Michael's article. Donald Trump was, and I don't know how serious these talks got, but Donald Trump was in talks in the 1980s to buy the New England Patriots. And boy, would I like to see the man in the high castle style story of how our world would be different if Donald Trump became the owner of the Patriots in the 1980s. I mean, what an impact that would have on sport, on culture. I mean, everything could be different.
Well, let's think about this. Tom Brady would probably be a high school coach somewhere right now. Never married a supermodel. What else would be different? I mean, certainly the Giants would have won.
Bill Belichick almost certainly never hired in New England.
Yep, never hired. I mean, what's Kraft doing right now? He's probably, you know, what's he up to? He found himself in some trouble. I mean, what's he up to now? So his life's changed dramatically as well. I guess a lot. The biggest cultural shift has got the no Deflategate. Never been a Deflategate.
Or maybe more cheating. Maybe there would have been more cheating.
No Spygate. You think?
I don't know. I mean, you're telling me that a Donald Trump team's not going to play fast and loose with the rules?
I don't think that is very true. That is very true. But how much do you think he would have driven that team into the ground? I mean, what kind of dumpster fire would that team have been?
It's hard to say because the Patriots at that point were already a dumpster fire.
Absolutely.
And we're already on the ground. I mean, the bar was on the floor.
What year are we talking about here?
It was in the mid-'80s, but I don't remember the exact
year. Was
that
before or after Steve Grogan played a Super Bowl with the toilet seat around his head?
I don't have that timeline.
Well, they played in the '86 Super Bowl against the Bears, correct? That was the Super Bowl. That was the Patriots played against. So was it before or after that? Because that's really the question.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have the timeline. But whenever it was, listen, there's no reason to think that even if Donald Trump got in there when they were on the high and were having success, that they would be able to maintain that success. And I make that point based on every business and undertaking the man has ever been in charge of. So, you can make an argument that the NFL would have one less franchise. It's entirely possible.
The first time they would have actually contracted.
Just entirely possible that New England would no longer be an NFL area.
And is there a relegation? Would they be like, we're going to send you to NFL Europe? We're going to send you down. Is there a scenario by which they would have been in the XFL? Donald Trump would have killed himself to get in the NFL, and then he would have still gotten put down to the USFL?
I mean, there's actually a pretty good chance that the NFL Europe would still exist because all the good talent would go over there just to get away from the show in New England.
It's entirely possible.
I mean, everything could be different.
I really don't understand. I don't get the fascination with owning an NFL football team. I don't understand what. No, I don't. I know Bobby Axelrod won one, but I don't. Look, I think it would be the greatest thing in the world to be able to, have a luxury box, kind of have carte blanche with the team. But I feel like everyone always hates the owner anyway, right? They never like the owner. They never appreciate what the owner puts in. They think they're greedy. I don't feel like is it that worthwhile to be able to stand up there and hold the trophy and be like, I won? And you didn't do anything. You just bought it.
It is, yes, to get to hold the trophy and say I won. That's why people do sports. But it's worth it for the same, it matters in the same way that the big contract matters for a player. It's not the value of it. It's what it represents. It's an untouchable. Yeah, it's an untouchable touch point that so few people get to that when you get there, you've made it. That's why people want to do it.
All right, let's take another step and leave the fact that owners are, by definition, billionaires. So leave that part. Would you rather be? Well, it's hard to leave that out, though. Would you rather be the team owner of a Super Bowl winner, or the coach, or the quarterback?
Well, if you leave money out of it, you'd rather be the quarterback. If you leave money out of it, of course you'd rather be the quarterback. No kid dreams of sitting and watching their team win a Super Bowl. They dream of being the quarterback.
Some very financially astute young business entrepreneurs of tomorrow in the business club, they're probably dreaming about it someday. Donald Trump did.
In the real world, you dream about being the person at the top of the food chain, the person who's paying everyone else's salary. That's always the best place to be.
Would you rather be the owner then, or the quarterback, money included? You're worth hundreds of millions.
The owner. It's not even close. It's not even a discussion.
You've never worked for anything in your life. You've never athletically put yourself on the line. You'd rather be the quarterback. I would.
They must have given you the good stuff when you went to the hospital for that burnt hand. That's all the time that we've got on this episode of Sportish. We thank you so much for joining us, whether it's on For the Fans TV or if you're listening to the podcast version, do give us a 5-star review and maybe leave a little comment as well. We're back with you next week. Thanks so much for hanging out. We'll see you.
Thanks for listening to Sportish. See you next time.